You're listening to episode 45 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author Brad Warner speaks with us about his new book, Sex, Sin, and Zen. Kamesu Mityachara Veramani Sikha Padang Samadhiyami. I undertake the training rule to abstain from sexual misconduct. This is the third training precept out of the 5 precepts one undertakes in Buddhist training. But what does it mean? And how does our modern culture's view of sensuality impact this not-so-modern rule? There are very specific actions listed as ones to be avoided in the Pali Canon pertaining to sexuality's misuse. The short form is in keeping with right intention in that we should avoid causing harm. The wonderful thing about this approach is that it allows our practice the flexibility to fit into different cultural contexts. What may have been socially stigmatized at one time may be acceptable in another. The core resolution we make is not hurting self or others. But there's also a component of abstaining from sex in certain situations, like on retreat, or for monastics of some traditions. Where we often get confused as lay practitioners is the distinction between non-attachment and giving up of sensuality altogether. Our guest today is Brad Warner, Zen monk, writer, bass player, and filmmaker. He wrote the books Hardcore Zen, Sit Down and Shut Up, Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate, and Sex, Sin, and Zen. He received Dharma transmission from Guru Nishijima Roshi, who received his transmission from Rempo Niwa Roshi, who, at the time, was head of the Soto sect in Japan. Brad is also a student of Tim McCarthy, who is a student of Kobun Chinu Roshi. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice sex on the beach. Really, what else was I going to say for this episode? And we're here with Brad Warner. Brad, thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it, and I will say that this is a hallmark episode because Brad and I, as it turns out, were born on the exact same day in a year that, well, it was a while ago. They're not going to confess to either of us, but it was a day that is, as Brad said, will live in infamy.
That's right.
Now, one of the things that we're here to chat about is your new book, Sex, Sin, and Zen, and we'll get there in a second, but what I'd like to do is have you talk a little bit about your own story as a Westerner coming to have a Buddhist practice.
All right. Well, I don't know if I was going to start saying my story is unusual, but I don't know. I think everybody's story is probably unusual to lesser and greater degree. But a lot of people I meet who are Buddhist practitioners got into it because they, spent some time reading about Buddhism and studying it and then finally committed to actually practicing. And I went about it the complete opposite way. I was in university. I was in Europe a lot of this year, and I learned that you can't say college over there because that means something different. So I started. Anyway, so I was in university, not college, and it was, I think, my first year. And I'd been vaguely interested in studying sort of Eastern spirituality, and I was sort of seeking some kind of a religious answer, which I thought would be found in Christianity. But I was not raised a Christian or anything, so I didn't have many preconceived notions or prejudices against Eastern religions, and I took a class called Zen Buddhism on a whim, and it could have been, I would have much preferred at the time to take a class on Vedanta or some kind of Hindu thing, because that was more where my interests lie, but there wasn't any on offer, so I took this class called Zen Buddhism. And I was immediately struck by the simplicity and directness and the realness of it, and by the guy who taught the class, who was a guy named Tim McCarthy, and he became my first teacher. And so I just started sitting. I started doing the Zazen practice immediately. And it was only later on that I started reading about Buddhism, and that actually had a detrimental effect on my practice, because I would read about people's enlightenment experiences and I'd be going, well, I'm not having any of these enlightenment experiences. Am I doing it all wrong? Or maybe I should stop, or maybe it's a big waste of time. I don't know. But I continued going. I was a member of a hardcore punk band. I was a bass player for this band called Zero Defects when I first joined, but Zero Defects broke up, and I continued doing a solo music career, releasing a bunch of psychedelic albums throughout the 80s, which was the best time in the world to release psychedelic albums. Not. And couldn't get anywhere with those, although now the whole psychedelic revival thing has taken off. I should have just waited. But
hey, you could re-release that stuff now.
Yeah, well, it's all available on iTunes. It's Dementia 13 is the band name.
Yeah.
There's 6 albums.
6? Yeah, you got 6
out there on iTunes. Yeah, because the last one, the 6th one, wasn't released at the time because I had some arguments with the record label. And I was actually on a real label. They were a small label, but I wasn't self-releasing these things. I was actually on a label. But I still couldn't make any money off of it. And I just, to make money, basically, to find a job, I went to Japan and became an English teacher there. And I'd been interested in Japanese culture only from the standpoint of I had an interest in Zen by then, and a much bigger interest in Japanese monster movies and Godzilla and all that.
So I went Gojira. There's no beating Gojira.
That's right. There's no beating Gojira. And I went over there and taught English for a year, and then I managed to get a job with Tsuburaya Productions, which is founded by Tsuburaya Eiji is his name, Eiji Tsuburaya, who did the special effects for the Godzilla movies and formed his own company and does this TV show called Ultraman. And
I remember Ultraman. I used to watch that.
Yeah, it played in certain. I watched it on the Cleveland TV station, and it was. I know more than I should because I worked for the company for 15 years. But I found out it played sporadically throughout the U.S. and in certain areas it was really popular. In certain areas it just never got shown. But
yeah, we had it in Chicago, and I remember watching it, and you had the whole outfit thing. I'm like, that's cool.
Yeah. Chicago was one of the places, and San Francisco it played, and obviously Cleveland and Boston, I think. But a lot of the country didn't get it. Anyway, I worked for them, and I wanted to study Zen some more, and came across a teacher named Gudo Nishijima, the main thing that attracted me to Gudo Nishijima is he had a convenient schedule for his Zen classes, and he was one of the few Japanese Zen teachers who would just take students, just anybody who wanted to come sit with him could join him, and that's very hard to find in Japan. It tends to be kind of the norm in Zen centers in the U.S. and in Europe to just be open to whoever wants to come, but that's not the case in Japan. It's not really closed, it's just sort of, the vague way Japanese people deal with things, but they're not really open to it. Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways to say no in Japan without saying no, that's difficult. Muzukashi desu ne. I go, yeah. It took me a while. It took me like a year of being over there to finally understand that muzukashi, which literally translates as difficult, means actually I'm not going to do it. Yeah. And so I found this teacher and studied with him, got very more deeply interested in the practice, but it was still just something I did for myself. And one day, I've been going to his classes, his lectures, his retreats, having little conversations or big conversations sometimes with him. Got to know him pretty well, and after maybe 7 years of this, he pulled me aside and said he wanted me to become his Dharma heir, and I was just like baffled by this. I was going to say blown away, but I wasn't so much blown away as just confused.
Yeah, you look over your shoulder like, are you talking to me?
Yeah. Because I had no desire to do this. I had no desire to be a monk or a teacher of Zen or anything like this. This is just something I did for my own sanity's sake, but I'd kept up with it for years, and I guess he saw something that he thought was worth, promoting? I don't know if that's the word, but so I hemmed and hawed about it for almost a year and finally said, okay, I'll take this ordination and I'll become your Dharma heir. And that's how the ball got started rolling, and he'd been encouraging me to write a book about it. I'd been a writer, a wannabe writer for years. I'd written, since I was a teenager, short stories and things, and I'd started by then writing novels, which I couldn't get published. I would send them out. So finally I just decided, okay, well, what the hell, I'll write down the story that I just told you in more detail. I'll write it down and make that into a book. And I finished it and I thought, nobody's going to want this book. This is just this has got Godzilla and it's got punk rock and it's got Zen in it. Nobody wants a book like that. There are no books like this. But I sent it out to some publishers anyway, and they all rejected me except one who was like very enthusiastically wanted to publish the thing. And I was, again, just baffled. Like, I wrote these novels that I thought were much better, that couldn't get published. And then this, kind of tossed off Zen book. But I think actually Charles Bukowski, apparently his gravestone says, "Don't try," and this was his advice to writers. And I think actually that's good advice, because it was when I stopped trying to write a sellable book that I finally wrote a book that sold.
Now, was that first one, was that Hardcore Zen?
Yeah, that was Hardcore Zen. Only the original title of Hardcore Zen, just to confuse everybody, was Sit Down and Shut Up. My publishers, Wisdom Publications, thought that you can't sell a book with a negative title, so they changed it to Hardcore Zen, which is much slicker and more commercial, and that was okay. I didn't object to it. So for my second book, with a different publisher, I really didn't have a title. It was my untitled book about Dogen, and I said, well, I was going to call the first book Sit Down and Shut Up. What do you think of that? And they're like, oh yeah, that's a great title. So,
it
goes to show you,
Yeah, it's a nice book. One of the things I wanted to share with the audience is that was my introduction to your writing. I've got a copy right. Yeah, this is the sound of that book. Wow. And the subtitle on that one I really like. It's Sit Down and Shut Up. Punk rock commentaries on Buddha, God, truth, sex, death, and Dogen's treasury, the right Dharma eye.
Yeah. Yeah, because I wrote this, I didn't know really what to do for a second book. That's why there's a long gap, if you look at the chronology of my writing, between the first book and the second. Because I was just kind of like, I don't know what to do. And so I wrote this book about Dogen, and then the publishers said, well, your first book was very autobiographical, why don't you put some more of that stuff in there? And so I managed to combine it with a little bit more autobiographical stuff and came out with Sit Down and Shut Up, which is, it's funny, that book is getting delayed recognition. People, when it first came out, it was a tough sell, and people didn't seem to take to it, but lately I run into a lot of people who really like that one, and so that's good, and it's got a nice cover, so maybe that helps.
It's, the cover itself is very recognizable, and part of the press I think that's getting is that you've got a podcast that is about this as well, and uses that same illustration of the mohawk spiked Buddha riding Godzilla, Gojira.
Yeah,
and
it's not Godzilla.
It's not Godzilla, isn't it? Who is it?
Well, we have to say that officially.
We have to officially, no, it's not Gojira. It's
Yeah.
not to be
trademark.
used as Gojira. Right. So how about
Godzilla is green and the monster on there is orange, so.
is orange? That's right. That's right.
Obviously not Godzilla.
Now, tell us about Zen Wrapped in Karma Dipped in Chocolate is another book that came out just before the one we're here to talk about.
That's the third book, and that was another case of not knowing what to do, but I had a publisher who were now, two books I'd written had sold well, and so they wanted another book, as publishers do. And I didn't know what to do with that, but I'd been on this promotional tour for Sit Down and Shut Up all throughout 2007, and these terrible things kept happening. You know, my wife split up with me, my job went down the toilet, my grandmother died, and then my mom died, just to cap it all off. And it was a pretty traumatic year, but during the whole time I was going around giving these talks at Zen centers all over the United States and Canada. I hadn't started going to Europe by then, but I started to see what was going on in the scene in the West, which I hadn't been really part of for most of my practice. You know, I was practicing individually with Tim McCarthy for almost 10 years, but I never was, you know, this was in Kent, Ohio. There was like 3 or 4 of us who would get together. It wasn't really part of any scene. And then I went to Japan, and then I came back, and it's all very popular. All of a sudden, this Zen stuff, this Buddhism stuff had become popular, and there were a lot of weird misconceptions about what it was and what it was supposed to be and what the teachers of it were. And I felt like a lot of the things that happened that became kind of scandals, a lot of them were legitimately scandalous things happened, but a lot of it was also kind of pushback from a group of people following Zen or Buddhist teachers who really didn't know what they were. They imagined them to be kind of gods or super people, and then they were horribly disappointed when it turned out they weren't. And you know, there were allegations, "Oh my God, you're a complete fraud because you had sex with someone," you know, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. You know, there's no vow of celibacy involved in Japanese style Zen. You know, and all that. So I decided to write a book kind of about that and talk about the things that I'd gone through and what it was really like to be a teacher of this stuff and what it is from the internal perspective, because it's very easy to kind of externally look at it and go, oh, those guys are being bad. If you don't know what it is to be one of those guys and to have this kind of stuff heaped upon you by an audience that at least believes it's being well-meaning and kind to you, but in some ways often is not being well-meaning or kind at all.
Right, and that's the self-serving kind of, you're misbehaving by my rules.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you, a lot of your training was in Japan. What are some of the differences that you're seeing between the way Zen in the Japanese culture is practiced versus how you're seeing it play out here in the West?
Well, yeah, the biggest difference is it's being practiced in the West. I think actually Zen, Zen's the one form of Buddhism I can really kind of speak to. There are all sorts of other kinds of Buddhisms, which is another thing a lot of people don't kind of realize. But I assume your audience knows. But anyway, the thing is, it's being practiced. So like I said, when I first went to Japan, my first teacher, Tim, had kind of warned me about this. He had never been to Japan himself, but he'd heard stories that when you go to Japan and there's Zen temples all over, and there really are. There was one right around the corner from where I lived, and you know, they're just everywhere. But most of them don't have a practice component. You can't go and sit zazen at these temples. The first place that I went to try to go practice zazen in Japan, I forget who, it might have even been me, called ahead to the temple. Somebody called ahead to the temple to find out when and where and whatever we could practice. we went there, a group of us, maybe 5 of us, and they just kind of let us in the door and showed us where the cushions were and went away. Because they don't do it, you know? They were just being kind enough to allow us to use their space, but they just don't practice. And it's rare in Japan to just find ordinary people doing Zen practice. Whereas in the West, and the temples I've been to in the US and Canada and Europe, that's the normal thing. The normal thing is everybody goes there to practice Zazen, and I think that's wonderful.
Yeah,
you know,
it's about practice.
It's not all about funerals and ceremonial things and you know, the way it's kind of degenerated in Japan.
So, what we're here really to chat about, I wanted to get into is, first asking you what led to writing your new book, again titled Sex, Sin, and Zen, a Buddhist exploration of sex from celibacy to polyamory and everything in between.
Well, when I first had the idea to write a book about Buddhist attitude towards sex, I thought, well, that's a nice idea, but I'm sure everybody's done it. And like you do when you have one of these ideas, I went on Amazon and places like that to see, you know, and Googled it and whatever to see what had been written. And I only managed to find a few books. And when I actually looked at those books, the best of them, there's one called Lust for Enlightenment, that's a good one, and one called The Red Thread. And those are kind of the best books, but they leave you off at maybe 1868, which is the time when the Japanese Meiji Restoration happened, and it became okay for Zen monks or Buddhist monks in Japan not to take a vow of celibacy. In fact, they were supposed to not take a vow of celibacy. And that's it. And what I was more interested in is we've got this whole growing population of Buddhists in the West, and we have a different attitude towards sexuality than any Eastern country. And so we have all these issues to deal with, and the only guidance we're kind of given about that is sex is really important. Be sure not to misuse sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
The end. And you're like, oh, what the hell does that mean? You know, because I first started getting interested in Zen practice when I was about 18, so this whole don't misuse sexuality was hanging over my head, and I know that I initially assumed that meant the same thing as the fundamentalist Christians I'd listened to meant when they said don't misuse sexuality, which would be no masturbation, no homosexual sex, no sex before marriage, and all this sort of restrictive stuff. I thought, oh, it's the same thing. It wasn't until I got to Japan that I realized it's not the same thing at all. There's a whole different attitude, and a lot of that attitude, the reason I wanted to call the book Sin, Sex, and Zen, because it's easier to say, and it also emphasizes the thing that I wanted to emphasize, which is there's no concept of sin in Buddhism, and that changes everything, as far as sex goes, because we grow up, whether we're steeped in the kind of fundamentalist Christian dogma or not, we tend to grow up, I did, and my parents weren't religious at all, believing that sex itself is somehow sinful or
right. It's a shameful private thing. It is not openly discussed and certainly not celebrated.
Yeah, and then you go to Japan and you find out there's no concept of sin, and they have their own particular weird sexual hang-ups and things in Japan, like any other country, but the idea that sex in itself is sinful is not one of them, or that the naked body is sinful. That's not one of them. People are naked in front of each other all the time, which, you know, was a little bit of a shock for this sort of Ohio-born person to be like, oh, you're naked, oh my god! You know? So there's a whole other world of relating to this stuff, and I thought it was important to talk about that and kind of get the discussion rolling. I don't know if I'm the best expert in the field or the best role model. I'm certainly not the best role model to follow or anything, but I felt like somebody needs to be talking about this. And I didn't want it to come all from my own experiences. And since you've read some of the book, I talked to a lot of other people who have experiences that I can't. I'm not gay, for one thing, so how do I find out what the gay perspective is? I happen to have a good friend who's a gay practitioner at San Francisco Zen Center. Surprise, surprise, there are gay practitioners at San Francisco Zen Center. Oh, God, yeah. And, and talking to Nina Hartley, who's a porn star and raised by two Buddhist monks, it's trying to give a fuller perspective than one person can give.
Now, one of the things that you bring up in the book isn't just sex and sexuality. You also bring up, at least in one instance, gender issues, and you talked about the kind of a underhanded, quick, fly-by-night ordination that Ajahn Brahm did, for which I greatly admire him. Of some nuns, and he was doing this kind of knowing that he did it in a quick fashion to make sure it got done before the temple that he's associated with had a chance to put in rules saying, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, I don't know the full details of it. Yeah, I don't know the full. You sounds like you know more details about the story than I do. When I was writing the book, that was just. That had just happened, and I feel like what I say about it in the book is it was very limited to it had just happened and it just started making the news. But the basic idea is that there's the Theravada tradition, which is sort of it's very similar to Zen in that they were trying to get back to the roots of Buddhist practice and find the original form of it. Which also Zen does, but their method of doing that was to kind of reject everything except what Buddha actually is reported to have said and done, and reject all the sort of later developments, and then try to build on that. And one of the things that had happened is that Buddha did establish an order of female monks, of nuns, but the order of nuns that Buddha established died out in, I say it in the book, I don't have it memorized, was it the 1200s or something? It was quite a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago, and I think, I'll try to find it, you keep chatting.
Well, anyway, they went under. So the idea that the Theravada school has kind of developed is, well, since Buddha isn't around to establish an order of nuns anymore, then there can be no order of nuns that's legitimate, and they refuse to ordain women, and this doesn't sit well for a lot of the Western adherents of the sect because, well, for one thing, they don't, and I'm not part of the sect, so I'm talking out my butt a little bit when I say this. So just hearsay is a lot of the people that I've met who are Westerners who are involved in that. Until the Ajahn Brahm thing came out, they didn't even really know that they belonged to a sect that didn't ordain women, because it just kind of never came up in conversation or anything. So some of them were pretty shocked by this. It was like a double shock. First the guy ordains women and then gets knocked down by the management for it, and then they're like, oh my God, I didn't know that we couldn't do that. So it's well, it becomes a kind of a power issue because I asked the first person who told me about this happened to be a woman I met in Canada, and I said, well, why don't you just leave?
Yeah.
And her response was very instructive. She said, well, we could leave, but we've got this temple that we're going to lose our funding for, and because the people in charge, I think in her case were Thai, and they were siding with the management who didn't want to ordain women, and it became kind of an economic and power issue. So they were kind of putting this sort of political and economic pressure on the groups, these North American groups to toe the line. And that's completely outside of what Buddhism is all about. And yeah, I'm very happy that I happen to belong to a Buddhist order that does and has very staunchly, historically ordained women for, 1,000 years or something like that. And has a lot of strong female teachers in it, and was founded by a guy, Dogen, who notably wrote this long sort of rant about how stupid it was to have sexist attitudes or to feel that. And he wrote this in the 1200s in Japan.
yeah, it's not a new concept.
Yeah, and said that this was ridiculous, that women are just as capable of understanding the deepest truths of Buddhism as men, and there have been many great women teachers, and just shut up with all this sexist nonsense. So yeah, it's a big issue, and when you're dealing with these kind of Asian cultural things, there's a lot of sexism over there.
And you say in the book, there are plenty of other ways to get into the teachings and practices of Buddhism without joining an organization that has ridiculous chauvinistic policies.
Yeah.
And where, to me, that really, this is one of the passages I highlighted because I wanted to mention that, is that in the Theravada tradition, and I will confess, I do retreats at Theravada forest monasteries. It's where I find the most comfort because of the teaching itself. Mm-hmm. And they're making great efforts in many of the more, in particular, Western monasteries,
right,
to engage and actively have a bhikkhuni order reestablished. And
that's great.
Now, one of the challenges they have with that is, I think you mentioned that here, is the monks alone in traditional Theravada practice have at least 227 formal rules.
Yeah.
And the bhikkhunis have over 300. And
yeah, a lot more.
It's challenging because in Buddhism, this is one of the first religious traditions, and whether we call it a religious tradition or a tradition, it's one of the practices that first had an ordination for women at all.
Yeah, in the whole world. Yeah, it's pretty amazing right there.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge thing, and much as there's often some aspersions cast of, Buddha didn't want to do it, Buddha didn't want to do it, Buddha didn't want to do it, according to what the supposedly occurred. And again, a long time ago, I wasn't there, I don't know.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, it was still done, and that was
done,
huge for the time.
Yeah, and especially the place too. Again, putting words in Buddha's mouth, I tend to read into it that the reason that Buddha, didn't really state his reasons for not wanting to ordain women, but I think it was because even when he was asked, he said that women are just as capable of reaching enlightenment as men are. That's what finally turned the tables, and he finally started ordaining them. So he definitely thought that right from the beginning. I think what he was more concerned about was that his order that he was trying to establish would collapse
within 500 years of doing so.
Because of the social pressure involved with the fact that they were ordaining women. He thought that would be too much for society to handle, and he wasn't ready to push it that far. But in the end, he did push it that far.
Yeah. And I find it most interesting that he does so. Really, two key things to me is, first, it's Ananda, is his right-hand man, who was really representing the women's side of view in this, because they'd gotten a no from Gautama, so they went to Ananda, who has kind of a history of being very open in his views about the equality of women.
Yeah.
And so he represented it again to them. And the first woman who I think, I may be incorrect in this, the first person who received ordination was Gautama's former mother-in-law. So there's the
whole... Is that Mahapajapati?
Yeah, right. It is like, I have to, it's my mother-in-law. I'm used to, I gotta do what she says.
yeah, probably. That was his reasoning, yeah. Yeah, but that's at the San Francisco Zen Center, they've added to the already interminable lineage that they chant every morning. They've added the female lineage, which is a really nice egalitarian thing, but I always think, why don't they just knock out some of the men and make room, because it goes on forever. Because, this chant that was already way too damn long is now twice as long because they chant the woman ancestors. But I think that's a great step forward that they've done.
Yeah. I went through Jukai at the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center here and received, the little lineage packet that's
Right.
this poster that traces all the way back from the very beginning, and
Oh, right, yeah.
it's like, holy buckets, that's a lot of names.
Holy buckets, that's a great phrase.
And it's a Minnesota thing. I learned it from the people here, from the natives.
Wow.
And I'm reminded of, what was the movie with one of the Quaids, Enemy Mine, where, he's on an alien planet and there's the alien who's dying, and he's got to learn the whole family lineage in this alien language that he's got to recite so that the alien's kid is fully accepted in their society. I'm like, really? That's what matters? It just seems a little strange that we hold on so tightly to these traditions, particularly in Zen, which tends to, not be as, it tends to question forms.
Oh, yeah. And also if you ask anybody who's researched the Zen lineage, they'll tell you, well, there's a few dubious things in there. There's a few things, I haven't traced it out myself, but there's a few instances there where if you actually look at the history of the people involved, there's no way they could have met each other, let alone been the disciple of one being the disciple of other, because there's like 150 years separating them and all this. So there's all kinds of nonsense in there.
Just the lineage stuff, and there's a lot of attachment to form, and it seems that it's an odd dichotomy within, in particular, Zen, because you have very formal things like oryoki meals.
Right.
Drive me nuts, because I gotta do this just so or I'm bad. And then there's the whole rejection of authority in one's individual practice that's really, really pushed. And it's like, how did those fit together? I've always kind of struggled with that in the Zen tradition.
Well, it's a good question, because it is true. It's on the one hand, it's very authoritarian in its structure, but then there's this ideal of being anti-authoritarian. So that throws a lot of people who get involved. I happen to study with two teachers who kind of were anti-authoritarian right down to the core. So I never really had to deal with the authoritarian side of Zen. Both of my teachers were not interested in ceremony, not interested in taking a personal authority stance or any of that stuff. So I had a little bit of a different, and people who go to a more, supposedly traditional temple they'll often have read books that are very anti-authoritarian and stuff, and then they get there and you have to do this, then, and this, you have to follow this bell and do this thing, and then stand over here and wait for that thing to ring and go in this place. And actually if you do some retreats and do that stuff, it sort of starts to make sense, because after a while you realize how freeing it is. If you just agree to abide by the certain set of rules, then you don't really have to do much else other than follow the schedule. And that's really easy, and that opens up a big space for you to get deeper into your Zen practice. Although, that gets abused too. I've heard about temples where they're whacking you with a stick until you got bruises and yelling at you and all that, and I think that's pretty much nonsense. But
yeah, it's interesting that we have that challenge of ritual itself is sometimes, particularly for people who are have had some not positive experiences with a devotional tradition, might have some problems with that. And there's, there can be some helpful effects to ritual in terms of getting yourself in the right frame of mind, not having to think, oh yeah, what am I supposed to do now? It becomes a positive habit such that you don't have to think about it. It's something where, okay, my mind can remain in a meditative state as I'm doing the forms.
Yeah, that's the idea of it. And the forms are kind of useful in themselves. All the bowing and all that stuff is not, it's funny. I didn't realize how much of an American I was until I left the United States. I always thought of myself as being this kind of rebel, unusual guy. And then I get to Japan, and I found out all Americans think of themselves as rebel, unusual guys. That's the whole, and that's such a stereotype of Americans, and I was like just such a stereotype American. And so we're all like hating authority and fighting against it all the time, and
You're an individual like everybody else.
yeah, and then, but there's something, I keep thinking about writing an essay called In Praise of Authority, because people come to me with this very anti-authoritarian kind of bent, and I'm that way too, and they sort of expect me to go along with it, but I think that there are places where it works, I was going to start off the essay by saying I met I had a friend who went to a weight loss clinic, and it did wonders for this person, because there was a huge authoritarian structure. And as long as you submitted to that authoritarian structure, it gave you the forms and whatever you needed to achieve your goal, which in this case was losing a lot of weight. And so there's a usefulness to it. But the problem with authority comes when you start believing in it. It's one thing to accept it. I think it's very important to be able to accept authority. And I think that's something we don't understand in our culture. We need to be able to accept it and also understand that it's not real. We are giving the power to the authority figure.
Right. It's an empty thing. It's not a thing. There is emptiness there, and it only has the power that we grant it.
It's bad when you get into the guru thing where you're saying, tell me, O guru, how I should live my life, and the guru's like, okay, sit on my lap and I'll tell you how you should live your life.
You chat about that a little bit in your chapter on BDSM and cult behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's something I kind of noticed. I became sort of peripherally acquainted with the BDSM scene in Los Angeles because I was going out with this girl who was, she was working at one of the dungeons. She was not one of the dominatrixes or anything like that. She was a receptionist, but she knew a lot of the dominatrixes, and through her I got to know some of them and see how they operated and see how that world worked. And it's very kind of instructive in a lot of ways. Just maybe this wasn't the point of the initial question you asked, but I thought one of the instructive ways was that because of the nature of the type of sex they engage in, it's very, very important that everybody be clear and honest and open with each other, which is something that a lot of us in the sort of normal world miss out on, because it's not quite as dangerous, I suppose. Nobody's going to get killed if things are done, wrongly. Whereas, that's a real risk that you're taking in some of the BDSM stuff. And so they're very, very careful with each other and very, very open and probably more honest. But the authority structure there becomes very, very crucial, because a lot of what they're playing with is erotic games based on authority and power. And
right, it's that power exchange that you talk about.
Yeah, power exchange is the word. And what I noticed is that was a lot of what happens in the world of spirituality, only it's not acknowledged in the world of spirituality. It's you are submitting to the power, the authority of the guru or the teacher or the master, and the relationship, well, sometimes it even becomes sexualized, but there are other things that can happen that don't even have to do with sex, that just have to do with giving over your own personal authority to someone else. And that can be a dangerous thing, because then, this is how, things like Nazism or the Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, where they have, nobody remembers them anymore. It wasn't that long ago, but they put the poison gas on the Tokyo subway systems.
Right.
When I was living there, and thankfully I wasn't using the subway that day, but I was in it was because people gave in to the guru authority of that guy Shoko Asahara and allowed him to take responsibility for anything they did. And you can't do that. It doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, it's a reasonable, this is part of what we touch on often is the whole letting go of self thing doesn't mean that you don't have a healthy perspective for reality and who you are.
Yeah.
And
You mean you need, I think the letting go of self thing, I mean, that's another issue I like to talk about in Buddhism a lot. It means understanding that it's illusory, but it doesn't mean getting rid of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you need it and you need it to get by. And a lot of people make that mistake. They're like, oh, I must rid myself of this sense of self. And you don't need to get rid of it. You just need to understand that it's ultimately a kind of game that you're playing with yourself and with other people. That's not real. And once you give that up, once you give up the idea that self is real, it's very freeing. You're no longer so concerned about this self that you've created, but you don't get rid of the self that you've created.
And we tend to see at that point that you're describing where we get to the place where we can let go of self that for many of us, that perspective snaps into place. And it's suddenly, okay, there we go. Things make a lot more sense. Because what often happens as people start the practice and they know a little bit about the teaching, I've heard at centers people say, I don't want to do this non-attachment thing. I love my kids. And that's just a clear misunderstanding of, no. You still love your kids. You still love your dog.
Yeah.
Not attaching doesn't mean you're detached. Different things. And the idea that, you as a lay person, your intent here is, not necessarily this supreme mystical unbinding with samsara. It may not be that kind of thing. It's just keep it in perspective. If you see that there is a no self, there you go. You got it. It doesn't mean you don't love your kids.
Right, I have the whole chapter in the book about that because I even print a couple of the emails that I've received over the years, and I receive a lot of them saying kind of the same thing. I don't want to get into this non-attachment thing because I love my kids, and I'm like, dude, it's not about, it's not that you're not going to love your kids anymore. You might love them more and more clearly once you stop attaching. What you're attaching to is an idealized notion of your kids, and that's something that becomes problematic, and anyone who's done that can see how problematic it is.
Yeah. And there's that old story about the oh goodness, how did this go? That there's a person who is soon to be the emperor, and they see the monk, and the monk asks, "How are you going to rule the people?" They say, "With wisdom and compassion." Mm-hmm. And the monk says, "Oh, then they will suffer terribly." Mm-hmm. And that's touching on the idea that you have your own view of what wisdom and compassion is.
Yeah.
You impose it on others, and that's not going to work so well.
Yeah. And real wisdom and compassion is the ability to kind of let go of your own idea of wisdom and compassion and let actual wisdom and compassion come through you in spite of
your own place in that. Yeah, in spite of that. That's the setting self aside.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier Nina Hartley. Not that I would know who that is, of course. that wouldn't be true. But you do interview her for the book. And why don't you tell a little bit about who she is for me, because of course I don't know. And talk about just a little bit about her story and why she's in this book at all.
Well, Nina Hartley is a porn star, and she got her start in the early to mid '80s as this young porn actress. And her the way I got I'd seen her movies and things, but
you might have seen an occasional movie walking by sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, I might have walked by the porn store and said, but yeah, I mean, I knew who she was. And this person I was going out with, the same one who worked at the BDSM dungeon, in fact, gave me this book, Nina Hartley's Guide to Total Sex, and I said, "Oh, thank you for this, book." And she said, "No, look at the acknowledgement section of the book." And I did, and there's a list of people from the San Francisco Zen Center in the acknowledgement section. And I'm like, what is this? This is weird. This porn star writes a book with a list of acknowledgements of several people in the San Francisco Zen Center. So I asked around. I knew some people in San Francisco Zen Center, and like, "Oh yeah, Nina Hartley's mom and dad have been here for years. They're monks." And I'm like, "Oh my God, really?" So I thought, I got to interview this person. I got to talk to her. I'll find out what this means to her. So I initially did an interview with her for Suicide Girls, which was just kind of an interesting, piece that was intended to help her promote that book, that Nina Hartley's Guide to Total Sex. But in the conversation, we talked a lot about the Buddhism and stuff, and how she felt about it. And she has done some practice. She doesn't consider herself a great practitioner, but she was married in a Buddhist Zen wedding ceremony by Mel Weitzman, who's the abbot of Berkeley Zen Center. And the Zen wedding ceremony is basically a Buddhist precept ceremony, which includes the vow not to misuse sexuality. And before she took that vow, she was a porn star, and after she took that vow, she was still a porn star. And she very much feels that she's upholding the vow, which made me realize that there's a lot of, I'd already was aware that there were a lot of ways you could interpret the phrase "do not misuse sexuality," and hers was a very kind of extreme case of a rather radical interpretation of what that means. But listening to her, I started to understand that given the world that she lives in and the job that she does and the way she interacts with people, I tend to agree with her. I don't think what she says goes for everybody, and she doesn't either. If I did some of the things she does, it would probably constitute for me a misuse of sexuality, but for her in the world that she's in, it doesn't. So it has to do with who you are and where you're coming from, and I think she does a lot of good for the people in that industry just by not leaving it. And her story kind of reminded me of what happened when I talked to my own teacher, Nishijima Roshi, when I was working for this company that made crazy monster movies for kids, these Ultraman and all this, stuff with these guys in these rubber costumes beating the crap out of each other and all this stuff.
Hey, those are awesome shows,
awesome,
man.
Yeah. Full of awesome, as my friend would say.
Yeah, they are made of the primordial ooze of awesome. Yeah.
That is it. But I felt kind of guilty about it because I thought, well, these are violent shows and they're very loud and they don't really seem to have much to do with Buddhism. Maybe I should just quit working with this company. And I came to, because I really liked working for this company, but I came to Nishijima and I said, I gave him this whole tearful thing about, I think I should leave Tsuburaya Productions because I'm, working on these terrible movies. And he said, don't quit working with Tsuburaya Productions. You can do more good, working for the company than you could by quitting it and going on some kind of idealized, whatever journey, that you think is going to be better.
Yeah.
So I ended up staying with them, and I feel like Nina Hartley is kind of following that same line of thinking in that she can do more by staying in that industry and being the person who pushes for it to become better, because it's not going to go away, porn is not going to end. The only thing that could put a stop to it or make it even slow down would be the total destruction of Western society or something like that. And I hope that doesn't happen. So if it's going to be there and if it's going to continue to be there, there need to be people in there who are conscious of its its problems and who are working to make it better for the people who are involved in it. And she's doing that. And I think that's a great thing. No, who else is going to do that? That's not so.
Right. And this also goes to the idea, and you chat about this a bit too in the chapter Getting Naked, the idea of right livelihood. And you say it seems to cause Buddhists in America more trouble than any of the other folds. And Nina will be an example of that. And you talk about, in that chapter, your old roommate's girlfriend who is a stripper, and how we start imposing our own views of right and wrong on people without having a full understanding of what the context is for the individual that's not us.
Yeah, and you can't really, this whole right livelihood thing really bothers a lot of people, and there's I didn't make this up, somebody else did, but I think it's true. It's the idea within American Buddhism seems to be that right livelihood means either being a therapist or a yoga instructor. Those are the only two things. Everything else is wrong. And everybody feels guilty about anything else they might do other than therapist or yoga instructor. But really, somebody who's a very conscious and ethical porn star is doing more good for the world than a half-baked yoga teacher or lousy therapist,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's what you bring to that. I mean, there are very few forms of livelihood I would be prepared to say are always and forever wrong. Maybe mafia hitman, might be always and forever wrong. But just about anything you do within reason could be a form of right livelihood if you take the right approach to
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah, and the challenge with that is an understanding and finding when we are rationalizing what is bad behavior
mm-hmm.
and when we're actually doing right things. And
that's really tough. Cause
you can't do it on your own. You need to rely on others to help.
Yeah, you need kind of a mirror to show you. You need a good mirror because sometimes your friends are just as lousy, as you are at figuring these things out. But you can, it's the danger there is you can find ways to rationalize anything. I kind of came across that in myself in my own practice, where it was just going on a long retreat and these things bubbling up to mind and realizing that I had the ability to rationalize any form of behavior, and it started making me understand how people like the Nazis can happen and things like that, because the human mind is powerful enough that you can create a chain of argument that makes anything sound reasonable, no matter how much your gut is telling you it's not.
Right. Yeah, and that's the delusion component to the human psyche is we don't always know, and that's what one of the things we do in our meditation practice is take an honest and hard look moment by moment at where is whatever coming from.
Yeah, you and it's hard to get to that point. I'm still working on it myself after years and years. I think I've gotten a little better at it, but it's difficult to be fully honest with yourself. And I think that's what Zen practice is really getting at, is trying to find that space where you can be 100% honest with yourself and therefore be able to be honest with everybody that you encounter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. One of the things I wanted to ask you about in the idea of questions that have nothing to do with Zen
mm-hmm.
is I want to direct people to your blog, which is hardcorezen.blogspot.com.
Mm-hmm.
And as you take a look at that, I was looking and you have pictures over on the left.
Oh yeah.
And one of the first ones to flash up is I think it's you standing with a slee stack.
Oh yeah.
Which of course endeared you immediately to me because on my cue ball at work I have a poster on the outside that has slee stack on it saying "Land of the Lost."
Yeah.
And people think it's a comment about work. No, it's not. It's just the show.
Oh yeah.
So where was that picture from? Because I don't see a lot of slee stack wandering around in Minneapolis.
Oh yeah, that's a San Diego comic convention that that I used to go to every year as part of the job that I did for Tsuburaya Productions when they sent me out to Los Angeles to be their rep in Los Angeles, and one of my jobs was to go to the San Diego Comic-Con, and they had like a giant flea stack. It wasn't a guy in a costume, unfortunately. It was a big kind of a model.
Yeah, it looks like a statue, a model. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was neat seeing that, because that, of course, took me back to, I was thinking about that tonight. It's like, well, I'd have to ask the question. You and I, all the best babies were born in March when you and I were. And at that age growing up, watching Land of the Lost, one of my favorite shows, of course, I had the biggest crush on Holly. And one of the things that turned me towards a secular life was, praying and praying and praying that I would get to meet Holly. And baby Jesus never delivered Holly to my doorstep.
She's cute. It's weird that you mention this, because just before I was kind of messing around with the computer before you came on, and I was looking at these Land of the Lost videos, and they branch off as they do to related videos. And there were a bunch of these things of, now I can't remember the name of the girl who played Holly, like grown up. There were videos of them, so I click on, and she grew up good.
Yeah, there are, for those of you who are interested in the Land of the Lost DVD set, not that I have it about 20 feet away from me, but it's along with me never having heard of Nina Hartley. There are interviews with Holly and Chaka and Will, and they're all there, really, except for the dad. They're there, doing talks. Holly was there. Cool. Kind of worth the effort.
Yeah. She's this cute blonde.
Yeah, she grew up nice, and the guy who was, Chaka, and I didn't realize this about him, and boy are we off topic, but that's part of the fun of the conversation.
This is Dharma.
This is Dharma. Yeah, this is it. For those of you listening, this is the practice.
Yeah.
He got that gig, and as he was like the youngest high-ranking martial arts
kid
in the country, and they had some, I think they had some scenes of him doing his stuff, and I'm like, he was really awesome. And he also grew up into this really, a good-looking guy. And their stories about, essentially growing up on the set for, I think, 3 seasons of this show, and what it was like with, her having a crush on him, but the other one has a crush on her, and how all that works. That is living. That's our moment by moment.
Brady Bunch had some really convoluted stories I've been hearing.
Mm-hmm.
You want that? I mean, because they weren't really brothers and sisters.
So one of the things I wanted to ask with you is a little bit. You've got the podcast is also out there, Hardcore Zen, and for those of you who are listening on iTunes, again, go to the webpage for the episode, because I put stuff on there, including the books and links to the podcast and stuff like that. Dementia 13. Chat a little bit about that too.
Oh, Dementia 13. Oh, sure. Nobody asks about that.
Other than, tell us the background of what Dementia 13 is, because I recognized it right away.
Oh, really? Well, it's a movie. That's where I got the name from. I made all these after Zero Defects broke up. Actually, even before Zero Defects, the hardcore band I was in broke up. I'd been really interested in 60s psychedelia, and I started making these tapes just in my basement, my little room, of these weird psychedelic songs, and I sent them to a record label, this label called Midnight Records in New York, that I knew was putting out these sort of psychedelic revival bands. And the guy J.D. Martignon, who ran the company, liked what he heard, and he wanted to put out records by me, and it was great. But he didn't like the idea of because solo artists, if you go out on just your name, nobody knows that name. It's for one thing, it's not very descriptive, and the only thing you can think of is another John Denver singer-songwriter type. So we invented the name Dementia 13, which I deliberately spelled wrong, but I think it just looks like a misspelling. In retrospect, I should have spelled it D-Y-M-E-N. That would have obviously been a deliberate misspelling, but I spelled it D-I-M-E-N-T-A 13. And, And I just kept putting out those records. I put out one a year for most of the 80s. They sold respectably for indie label releases, but it, like I said at the beginning of the interview, it wasn't making me any money. But the idea was to be this sort of a band out of time that was this psychedelic rock act. My initial sort of scenario for Dementia 13 was they were a band that was frozen in a block of ice in 1967 and thawed out, 20 years later, and had to make albums, so that they would be, this sort of imaginary band would then be allowed to take advantage of whatever technology and stuff existed, contemporary technology and stuff, but they would be coming at it from a different perspective, because they would have bypassed the entire 70s and 80s, which I kind of wished I could have done.
Yeah, a lot of us look back on that time and are like, oh boy.
Yeah, stonewashed denims and muffs and all that stuff.
Now, on your web, you also have a link. There's also homepage.mac.com/doubtboy.
Oh, right, yeah.
And there's a link on there, a site tour for 2010, and that's exhausted. I was wondering if you have any schedule coming up or that you're working on for 2011.
I am. I'm already working on it. There's some gigs that look like they're going to happen. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, St. Louis, Missouri, maybe Lawrence, Kansas. I'm still kind of waiting to hear back from them. Cocoa, Florida. Stony Brook University. I'm going to be there in New York. So there's several coming up, and I just need to get it together to announce. The only one that I've kind of committed to on paper is the Stony Brook University thing. The others are all probably going to happen, but tentative.
When's the Stony Brook?
That's March 25th and 26th. I'm going to be out there. I'm going to be going to Saskatoon and New Brunswick in Canada as well in March. I just don't have the date yet.
Well, thanks so much for being here. I wanted to make a special thanks to your publicist, Kim Corbin. Has been terrific in setting this up. So, Kim, thank you. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Kim.
Been terrific. And Brad Warner, hardcorezen.blogspot.com. Brad, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.